Welcome to the 2014 State CTE. My name is Leah Loomis, and I am the Digital Media Coordinator at ACTE. Just a few things to keep in mind before we get started. Please mute your mics during the presentation. I know we tend to get a lot of background noise, and sometimes it's a little distracting to the audience and some of our presenters. So if everyone can do that now, that would be fabulous. And then also, for those of you interested, the PowerPoint presentation will be available on ACTE's website under our Policy and Advocacy publication page, and also on NASA CTEC's website. As for the recording, we will also have that available on ACTE's YouTube page, on our online seminar channel, and we'll also make that available to NASA CTEC and everyone else with us today and the public. Lastly, we'll have a Q&A at the very end of the presentation. So for any questions or concerns regarding the presentation or for our speakers, if you could hold off on those, you can write them in the chat box and I'll collect them at the very end. I will have a 10-minute Q&A for our presenters. Then, all right, so to kick things off, just to give a brief overview about why we're having this presentation today. ACTE and NASA CTEC, today they published a joint report that breaks down the key legislation and other CTE-related adopted in those areas. And today our online seminar features Catherine Imperator and Andrea Zimmerman. Right, thank you. No problem.
All right, I'll just take this away. So my name is, I'm going to move aside, there we go. This is Catherine Imperator. I'm with the in Technical Education. And I just want to start by a little background on the state and federal policy context in which we produce. And if anyone is, as people, please do just make sure that you mute your line. It sounds like we're getting some feedback.
Hi, Catherine. I think you're going in and out a little bit. Your audio is fading in and out.
Okay. Let me try. See if this is any better.
Perfect.
Okay. So as you know, both ACTE and NASA CTEC work on tracking and working to impact CTE policy on the federal level. And of course, we are working on an anticipated Perkins reauthorization, which may be coming up here this year in 2016. We also are interested in the most recent and long-awaited reauthorization of the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act that was passed last summer and how that relates to CTE, as well as the Higher Education Act and ESEA, which are both also coming up for review soon. And we work with policymakers in our CTE caucuses on the Senate and congressional level. But as you may have noticed, federal policy has been moving very slowly the past few years, and it's been hard in that climate to get things done. State policy has been a lot more exciting in the past few years. You will see some similar topics as we go through this presentation, talking about what states are doing and what we talk about on the federal level, topics such as programs of study and career pathways, data and accountability, and working with industry, leading to industry-recognized credential attainment for students. But states have definitely been active, and that's really where it's at, and we're going to dig into a little bit more of that with today's presentation. So I am just going to pass this over to Andrea.
Thanks, Catherine. I really appreciate this. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the paper and how we approached this series. And so this is actually the second installment for the State Policies Year in Review. Last year was our first edition, and this year we took a similar methodology. And so what we found was there were 46 states as well as the District of Columbia that had activity. But first, before we get started, how did we decide which policies made the cut? Well, we looked at the legislation and policies in this year's edition and compiled them through a thorough review of a number of sources, including state policy websites, state government websites, media stories, compilations from organizations such as the education commissions of the state. And once we compiled those, ran those past the state directors for CTE in each of the states, as well as the ACTE state association leaders. And then any of that feedback that we received, we included in this final report. Now, the activities were only included in the report if they were finalized or in some cases implemented in 2014, not merely initiated. So, for example, a piece of legislation that passed in 2013 with an effective date of July 1, 2014 would not have been selected for this report. It would have appeared in last year's edition. However, any legislation that was signed into law during 2014 was included. We also included activity from state agencies as well as state regulatory bodies such as the State Board of Education or Board of Regents on the post-secondary level. And then again, with a focus as much as possible on new policies rather than those natural next steps that come and stem from previous legislation. Also, a quick disclaimer, the activity noted in this series does not imply an endorsement by NASDA, CTEC, ACTE, or the state CTE leaders. Rather, it's the hope that by collecting these policies into one document, NASDA, CTEC, and ACTE can continue to inform the community and in turn lead to the adoption of positive CTE policies across the 50 states. And so with that, I want to present you with a table that is in the report as well. And this is the overview of all of the policies. We grouped them into categories, and then we have here listing the number of states addressing these different policy areas. And today in this webinar, we're going to be digging through the a variety of these categories. We won't be hitting all of them, but quite a few of them we will. And so also to note, the policies listed here are not completely exhaustive. There were some areas like veterans issues and some scheduling that we took out of the policy table, but they are included in the full report. And so we encourage you to certainly take a look through that and see the state-by-state run through. So with that, as I said, there were 46 states and DC that had roughly 150 state policies impacting CTE this year. And this is just another clear trend that we're seeing from the states. Also last year, we saw a clear trend from the states showing that CTE is an area of interest for policymakers and lawmakers. And again, this year we were seeing the same. Also, it should be noted that the STEM category, we define STEM legislation as those referring to activity using the term science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, and considered those for the STEM category rather than areas where it could be included, such as manufacturing, but wasn't explicitly mentioned. And so with that, I'm going to pass everything back to Catherine and let her talk a little bit about funding in CTE.
Thank you. So this year we saw that the top category, the policy area with the most action in the most states, was funding. And this is consistent with our 2013 report. We also found the same, that funding was the top policy category. Now this includes a variety of actions, whether a budget line item for a CTE program, a grant program, or a scholarship program, perhaps with a tax incentive for businesses. Those are all examples of the different kinds of funding legislation and policy that we observed. So obviously there were several in this area. I'm just going to highlight a few that kind of cover those different categories that I just mentioned. So for instance, in California, legislation formally established the Career Pathways Trust Grant, which had been originally funded in the prior year's budget and then was funded for 2014 through 15 at $250 million. And this is a competitive grant program, which we do see becoming increasingly proposed by policymakers on both state and federal levels. And the recipients must ensure that the pathway programs lead to a valuable credential in a high-skill, high-wage, and high-growth or emerging field. And they also have to ensure that there's collaboration, that there's opportunities for work-based learning, and that they're leveraging other sources, existing sources of funding. So that is one example. Another example in South Dakota, taking a different route, is the Build Dakota Full Ride Scholarship Program, which is part of a public-private partnership with a particular philanthropist in the state. This will lead to an estimated 300 scholarships over 5 years to students who are entering high-need workforce programs at South Dakota's technical institutes. In exchange, the recipients do need to agree to live and work in the state in that field of study for 3 years after graduation. Another example is in Alabama, where the state both appropriated funds for dual enrollment specifically for CTE programs, and also established a scholarship program for that CTE dual enrollment. It's meant to be funded by private donations, and those donating businesses or individuals will in turn receive a tax credit equal to half of their donation, and the donations can be mostly directed to particular CTE programs. And then in Iowa appropriated funds for a number of CTE relevant programs. One in particular is the KIBI Skilled Workforce Shortage Tuition Grant Program, and that supports students in targeted for-credit community college CTE programs. So a key trend that you're probably observing here is a need for meeting the needs of employers and for industry support and involvement when it comes to these funding issues. So now I'm going to pass it back over to Andrea.
Thanks, Catherine. And thank you for pointing out that, we're seeing a lot of employer engagement and employer collaboration. And so these next two topics have a lot of things in common, and they often overlap. But the second topic we wanted to talk about was industry partnerships and work-based learning, which was somewhat of a new category in terms of popularity that we saw this year. And as you can see, 28 separate states had activity in this area, some with more than one legislation or policy passed. And it was a very interesting kind of new trend that we saw this year. And to some degree, this is actually not a surprise when we think about what's happening on the federal level as well as in the states of employers wanting to get involved, wanting to have a skilled workforce and a workforce that's prepared to be able to meet the needs of the 21st century. And in fact, NASDA CTEC recently published a paper looking at the state of employer engagement across states. And we really did find a lot of activity across the spectrum there. And so similarly, the interest behind industry-recognized credentials often stems from employers, wishing for students to leave high school or post-secondary education with a demonstrated set of technical skills. And so what I want to do is kind of take us through just a few examples that we have here. So Iowa, another funding initiative that they had was $1.5 million for a statewide network of intermediaries to increase work-based learning. And so what they did to do this was they actually used the state's 15 community college regions in order to actually create and find the reach of a full state coverage. And the initiative created the statewide network that connects secondary, post-secondary employers and other community stakeholders to create and sustain a range of work-based learning opportunities for students. And that collaboration is actually something we were seeing a lot across the states, of tying grant funding to having employer partners partnering with the local education agencies or the higher ed institutions to make sure that their voices are equally at the table and that they're all working together to really align their programs. On the industry-recognized credentials side of things, we have Kansas here, who actually, this stems back to a 2012 initiative that they had, but this year they ended up pouring even more money into this Excel in CTE initiative that they found, due to such student interest and participation, the numbers far surpassed what they had originally budgeted for the program. And the initiative allows Kansas high school students to qualify for free college tuition in approved technical courses at the state's technical and community colleges. And the program also provides school districts with a $1,000 incentive for each student that graduates with an industry-recognized credential in a high-need occupation. And so they ended up going back to the legislature and having to ask for more money to be able to accommodate all of the student interest that they had. Additionally, Illinois and Delaware had some grant programs, again, looking to try and train a workforce in those critical industries such as manufacturing. And then finally, Florida, they actually are looking at it from a different angle of having the state agencies, State Department of Education, provide a return on investment information to parents and students regarding the industry certifications and the system that they have there. And with that, Catherine, I'm going to give it back to you.
All righty. So another policy area that was active in 2014 and also in 2013 was related to graduation requirements. And this, you see 15 states here with policy in this area. And this is a range. It goes from course equivalencies, where CTE is able to substitute for a requirement for graduation in perhaps a math or science course. It sort of ranges all the way to CTE options and pathways to graduation. So again, I'm just going to highlight a few examples. We did have several states where CTE courses were, legislation made it so that CTE courses could substitute for academic courses toward graduation. In one example, for instance, Missouri, now the department must allow certain CTE and ag courses to substitute in both math and science, which we see pretty often, but also in communication arts or social studies, which usually sometimes you see less often those academic core subjects with CTE substitution. So a number of states had something similar in that reign of course substitution and equivalency. A little more dramatically, in Louisiana, legislation called for the creation of a career diploma. It would be earned through going through a career major program and would have equal status to a standard diploma. And this legislation aligns with the Jumpstart initiative that state also launched in 2014. Now, in New York State, the Board of Regents has preliminarily approved multiple high school graduation pathways, including in CTE and STEM. Those are going to be formalized, I believe, in early 2015. Andrea, jump in if I'm misstating that one. And it would allow states to allow students to replace one of the 5 required Regents exams with a comparable assessment, for instance, in a technical area or in arts. And then Ohio, kind of similarly, has created some options for students after they take their end of course academic exams. There are a few different options. They can either get a cumulative score on those end of course exams, or there are options instead of making that cumulative score. They can earn a particular score on the ACT or SAT, or they can earn a state-approved industry-recognized credential or license, as well as if achieving a proficient score on a job skill assessment. So that would be one option toward graduation for those students in Ohio. All righty. And Andrea?
Thanks, Catherine. So the next area that we wanted to focus on was dual enrollment and concurrent enrollment, as well as early college and articulation. It's a big category, but all of it really has to do with the kind of transfer policies and making sure that students are able to take the credit that they've earned with them to other institutions, also bring credit before they are getting into post-secondary itself and while they're still in high school. The other area we're going to focus on is data reporting and accountability. And so with that, the fact that the third most common category was dual enrollment really wasn't much of a surprise to us, because this was also consistent with last year's report. Policymakers are continually looking at the areas of dual enrollment and articulation, given the complex nature of this area. Often these dual enrollment courses are taught on high school campuses to high school students by high school teachers, other times the instructors from a post-secondary institution, and trying to ensure quality, rigor, and uniformity in these courses is an ongoing challenge that often requires some sort of a policy action to be able to overcome. And so with dual enrollment, actually, since we already talked a little bit about those Alabama dual enrollment tax credits and scholarships, I want to focus a little more on Nevada and some of the work they did last year. And although Nevada didn't have a legislative session last year, their State Board of Education and the Board of Regents was very active. And one of the things that they did was approve a new policy to develop statewide articulation agreements for all CTE programs of study. They also rebranded their dual credit programs and gave it some kind of a marketing name to it. And also Tennessee, their Board of Regents established a system-wide admissions policy for all dually enrolled students to help bring further clarity and transparency to the process. Other states, for example, expanded the grades eligible to participate in dual credit programs, such as Oregon, which expanded it to include students in the 9th to 12th grade. And in Florida, actually, grades 6th through 12th are now eligible for dual enrollment courses. And then with data reporting and accountability, transparency is often the main driver behind this topic. and it can range from informing students about employment rates, salaries, and other data to school report card accountability. So, for example, Maine passed a law creating the State Education and Employment Outcomes Commission, and we saw a lot of similar activity regarding this across the states this year. And this Maine legislation directed this new commission to develop procedures on maintaining and disseminating education and workforce data. And another one was in New Jersey, where career readiness indicators were added to the school report card accountability, and they actually recently just came out with kind of these new report cards that feature this, that comes from the new legislation that was passed last year. And states such as Indiana and Missouri made sure certain grant funding was contingent upon performance-based outcomes such as graduation, and so they would need a system in place to be able to show these, what that data is. And so with that, Catherine, I'm going to pass it back to you to look back a little bit on 2013.
Great, thank you. So this is our second annual report, so we only have 2 years to compare. Ideally, as we go through, we'll have a much broader base to draw trends from, but we did want to just look a little bit at some of the differences between 2014 and 2013. And one of the most striking that you'll notice first off the bat is that there were more actions overall. So you see some higher numbers here in the right column, which is the number of states who had action in a particular category in 2014 versus in 2013. Now, the comparison here doesn't work perfectly because we employed some different categories this time than we did in the prior year, just because, the policies that came out were a little bit different, and we wanted to reflect that. So on the left, you see the 2013 policy areas, and then the number of states in 2013 and the number of states in 2014 who matched those policy areas. And I'll just touch on a few things. Funding, obviously, we discussed this was the most popular category in both years. Now, in governance, there was much less attention paid to such activities as amending governance structures, creating task forces or councils, and clarifying, who has regulatory authority over particular programs. We saw a lot less of that in 2014 than we did in 2013. Dual and concurrent enrollment, again, this was the third most popular category in both years, but lots more action this year, including some policies related to early college high schools and to articulation and transfer, both on the post-secondary level as well as between the high school and post-secondary level. Graduation requirements, you see a sort of similar amount of action. One difference was that there wasn't as much in competency-based education as there had been the prior year. So we tracked, I believe, 2 states with policies related to competency education and prior learning for veterans that just didn't make it into the overall big chart because it was only those 2 states. STEM and data reporting and accountability, kind of similar levels of action. In partnerships this year, we tracked industry partnerships in particular. Partnerships within the education system were mostly, we found, covered by the dual and concurrent enrollment category, the articulation and the partnership that is needed to make that happen. And then you see a big growth in the assessments and industry certifications line there, and that is mostly due to growth in industry certification-related legislation as opposed to legislation related just to assessments not related to actually earning that certification, but other types of technical assessments. So that's just a few of the different things that you see, but a lot that was fairly consistent across year to year. But again, just an even greater focus on that industry relationship and a little bit of less attention paid to those governance structures. Alrighty, and Andrea is now going to tell us a little bit about states have already been active in 2015 too, and she's going to tell us a little bit about that.
Thanks. So with all of the activity that we saw over the last 2 years, kind of that natural question is, so what are you expecting to see in 2015? And we've already gotten a little bit of a taste of what potentially to expect, even though legislative sessions have really only been active for as long as a month, potentially just even a couple of weeks or days. and with some states that have not even convened yet. But really, we can start to get that taste through the State of the State address. Similar to the President's State of the Union address, governors often give a State of the State address. Sometimes this is combined with a budget address. But traditionally, it is given near the beginning of each legislative session, and we've already, since the end of January, seen 31 governors who have given these State of the State addresses. And these are important speeches because they lay out the priorities for that governor's administration and really for the state for the coming year. And so you can imagine with all of the different issues facing a state, you would have many, many different areas that are jockeying for that coveted space in a speech like this. So it was notable to us when we looked back at the speeches that have already been given and seen that of the 31 speeches, CTE appeared in some capacity in at least 40% of those speeches. And that ranged from maybe a passing mention of the value of CTE or some of the work that's already been done, like they did in Kentucky, to even some major initiatives, or if not even proposing an initiative, just really laying out what the power of CTE is. We saw some major time devoted to it in speeches from Indiana, for example, where Governor Pence proposed an increasing the CTE funding by $20 million a year, and also talked to increasing the number of industry-recognized credentials that the state's population receives, and wants to see that, I believe, expanded by fivefold by a certain number of years. And in Nevada, where Governor Sandoval devoted a lot of time talking about education generally in the state and the amount of money the state is and should be spending on education, as he believed. And when it came to CTE, he proposed expanding CTE to include also new grant programs to ensure college and career readiness. Also, in West Virginia, the governor there, Governor Tomlin, he actually focused on CTE teachers, which is also a critical area, as many of us know in the community, for recruiting high-quality CTE teachers into the field and into the classroom, Now, California, you see a little asterisk here, partially because CTE was not mentioned in the State of the State address. However, there was a major funding proposal that was put forth by Governor Brown in his budget called the Cte Incentive Fund, which would allot $750 million over 3 years and would require funding matches from I believe, dollar-to-dollar funding matches from schools, and also encourages those collaborations and partnerships. And again, that similar refrain of collaboration, partnership, employers, working together, coming out again in that. And so with that, Catherine, actually, I would like to maybe pass it back to you one more time.
All righty, thank you. So I'm just going to kind of summarize all this and talk a little bit about what this can mean to you as a state CTE leader. Basically, it's an exciting time, but it's also a pretty quick-moving time. We see things moving definitely more quickly on the state level than on the federal level. So, number one, of course, it's important to stay informed of these policy changes, to track what's going on in your state legislature from the introduction of bills through their passage or not. This is also a great time to have some impact. State policy can be easier to impact than federal. So these are great opportunities to leverage for advocacy. Your policymakers are probably increasingly eager to tour high-quality CTE programs, for instance, and the media to cover those events. So this is really the time to get your voice out there. And building on that, this is also the time to really build better partnerships. Employers are interested in CTE, local workforce investment boards, chambers of commerce, industry associations, as well as policymakers. This is what they're hearing. They're hearing this refrain, and you have the opportunity to tell them how you and your programs fit into developing a prepared and adaptable workforce. All righty. So I think that about wraps up our formal presentation. So if you have any questions or anything like that, Celia, do you want to go over that process?
Yep, that sounds great. Again, if you have any questions, feel free to use the chat box. Just give me 1 minute. I'm going to open up the lines to everyone. And then also, if you have any, you feel free to ask your questions as well using the audio that we have available. But we actually have a few questions already lined up. Catherine. All right. With questions, we just have some background noise going around.
That sounds better.
So our first question is, which policies do you think hold the most promise for advancing HQCTE?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that one more time? I just got a little blipped out there.
No problem. Which policies do you think hold the most promise for advancing high-quality CTE?
Question.
I can jump in at least first, and then Catherine, feel free to tag team on this. I think that when you think back to states like maybe Tennessee or, Nevada, when they're starting to think about how CTE crosses the education spectrum from K-12 to post-secondary and to workforce, and you're aligning those policies to have the greatest impact for the greatest amount of students, then that's kind of really where, the type of policies that can have the greatest impact. So that can be dual enrollment, articulation, but any of those kind of that are strategically aligned to really hit the widest swath of folks and affect them, that's really where policies can have their greatest impact.
Yeah, I agree, and we've seen in these past couple of years some instances of very comprehensive pieces of legislation that have included career pathways leading across various levels of education to valuable credentials involving many different partners and stakeholders, and that's something that certainly holds a lot of promise.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you for your comments. So we have another question lined up. Are there any states Are there any states with rural consortia not clustered around a center who recently developed or would be willing to share consortia guidelines and structured documents? Sorry, that was a bit of a long-winded answer, but if you need me to restate that, feel free to ask.
Could you repeat it? The phone broke up just a little bit.
No problem. Are there any states with rural consortia not clustered around a center who recently developed or would be willing to share consortia guidelines and structured documents?
That sounds like a question for our audience, actually, which is great.
Well, I could point to Minnesota. They really have done a lot of work in the consortia area. They have a lot of challenges with being such a large state and many rural areas, and they have done a lot of work in this space. Right now I can't probably talk to it extensively, but that's where I would point you to, as well as the National Center for Innovation in CTE. Hope I got all that correct. They recently just came out with a report talking about the characteristics of consortia, and they also have some online trainings that you can take. They're on demand, I believe, and you can find that at I'll look up the web address, but I believe it's cte.ed.gov. You can get to the center from there, but those would be a lot of really great resources to take advantage of.
Hello?
Perfect. Thank you so much. Yes? Do we have a question?
This is Joanne Simser. This is Joanne Simser from Minnesota, and you can find documents about our consortium relationship and how those were developed on our website, and I'll type that in the chat for you.
That's perfect. Thank you so much.
One other thought, actually, to add to this, although it's not consortia per se, and by the way, thank you, Joanne, for saving me and jumping in there. But I also wanted to point to, I mentioned the employer engagement paper that NASDA CTEC has put out. You can find it on our website, careertech.org, and there's a lot of guidance that we found in the process of researching that report. And this is guidance for local advisory committees and, partnering and collaboration, and so there may be elements there that are probably would be useful. And we have a full kind of attached list of state-by-state examples that I think would be the greatest resource as well.
Perfect. Thank you so much for your comments. And let's see, we have a few more questions lined up for you all. Why do you believe there is a marked increase in state policy activity and interest in CTE? Is it the skills gap, increased evidence of impact, changing perception of CTE? So what are your feedback on that question?
I would say it primarily results from the media coverage and attention paid to the skills gap in the wake of the recession and the context of a sluggish economic recovery. We're seeing that industry needs are increasingly a consideration in education, and I think sort of that those messages coming from industry are what policymakers are largely responding to, as well as innovations in CTE that we've been seeing now for several decades, but that are starting to come to a broader public attention.
Very nice, thank you. And I think we have just one more question lined up for you all.
Actually, so Leah, I'll just jump in to add to that if possible. The other thing to think about is, we always hear that phrase, college and career ready, but really when you've looked at the policies, going back a few years, really most of the policies are focused on college ready, but not so much truly looking at career ready. And I think that that's another area that you're going to see increased activity, and states are interested, and they're trying to define what that really means.
Very nice, thank you. So we have a few more questions left for you all. So does the 46 states with funding-related policies and programs suggest this is all new funding? Has there been a net gain?
That's an important question. And, one that's always important to ask. And the thing is, truthfully, we don't really know. The way that CTE is funded across the states, it varies from state to state. And sometimes you can see a major funding increase in a new program, but that might actually be, not always making up for the losses that were felt from the recession, for example. That's where, education took a lot of hits. And they haven't always been able to make up that deficit. And I think that actually if you look at the National Association of State Budget Officers, they have a really great analysis showing that, in fact, most states have not gotten back to pre-recession levels. And I know that's the same issue with Perkins. But another, thing to also consider is, there's a lot of interest in doing new programs, of piloting new initiatives. And sometimes it's great to pilot these things, so you get to test. It's kind of this lab of innovation, and you can test new theories, see how they work. But also, if you're always looking to test new things, you may be diverting important resources away from core programming. And you want to make sure that you're keeping that core funding, as well as on top of that adding the pilot programming to look at that.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Andrea, and that kind of goes back into our disclaimer from earlier. Just because these policies happened and focused on CTE does not, necessarily imply our endorsement, or that you, as state leaders, would be satisfied with the way that they're implemented or with the focus and approach that they take. So it's definitely more complicated than it seems sometimes.
Thank you again. We just have a few more here. Let's see. So kind of tell us a little bit about, I know one question was about education systems that do not recognize the importance of industry connections as a component of teacher preparation at a secondary level. Has that surfaced as a concern anywhere?
And sorry, that was education systems that are not interested in the workforce?
Yes, so some education systems that do not recognize the importance of industry connections as a component of teacher preparation at a secondary level. Has that surfaced as a concern?
I would say not through this process, since we're looking at what has happened. Andrea, do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, actually, I believe that, with CTE, a lot of the certification actually is alternative. So the teachers finding their own way into the classroom, not through those traditional methods, as you might say. I mentioned, West Virginia, Governor Tomlin, actually, that was one of the things that he was talking about as well. in his State of the State address of, understanding that value and of removing the barriers that make that possible to increase that pipeline. So there's definitely a challenge, and CTE teacher recruitment is something we hear about a lot, but that's, I guess, some things to kind of think about.
Very nice, thank you. And then another question is the state policy activity focused more on secondary CTE or post-secondary CTE, or both?
Well, this paper, we focused on both secondary and post-secondary, and, we didn't count to see sort of which was more active. I would say they were both pretty active, but just off the top of my head, I think post-secondary might have had a little bit of a nudge ahead. They might have had a little bit more action, at least in 2014, but certainly a lot related to the connections between the two as well.
Yeah, I would agree with kind of that idea of the connection between the two. We saw a lot of activity that really was focusing and understanding that, CTE doesn't end terminally with the senior year graduation from high school, but that it does extend into post-secondary in some form. And I think that we saw that trend a lot this year in particular. Also, I wanted to point out, I see that Joanne Simser from Minnesota has actually provided a link in the chat box for everyone to kind of this map of the consortia that they have in the state and a PowerPoint that hopefully will address those questions. And I know that they have a lot of really wonderful resources on that website, so I encourage everyone to check that out. Thanks, Joanne.
Very nice. Thank you again, Joanne. Let's see. If we have any questions. So another question is, are there any states taking on perception issues related to CTE through marketing or branding campaigns?
Actually, I know Alabama had I want to say $200,000 line item in their budget this year, and it's included in the paper, that it is actually a marketing, to fund a marketing campaign that targets parents. We know that one of the greatest barriers to students entering CTE or being interested in those areas often are their parents who have their own, kind of outdated perceptions of what CTE is. And so I know Alabama in particular has that, that was in their, that was put into the state budget. Also, this wasn't necessarily something that was done legislatively, I think, but South Dakota actually this year, this year, by that I mean 2014, in early 2014, put out their, if you Google it, South Dakota My Life, and it was this really wonderful resource put out there to help demystify what is CTE and how does it work, how can it work for me, and also, you can see a lot of this in the governor's priorities. The governor has a huge bully pulpit that he or she can use, and definitely South Dakota did that last year. Kentucky Governor Beshear is also another one who often is up there talking about CTE, and, when it's coming from those prominent figureheads, it carries a lot of weight.
And we have addressed a lot of our, majority of our questions in the chat box right now. If there are any questions, feel free to use the audio. You're more than free to ask questions to our speakers. If you're more comfortable in the chat box, I can help you with that as well. Then let's see if we have any more.
Leah?
Yes?
I'm sorry, I did get a question. This is Catherine. I did get a question on middle school and whether middle school CTE was a focus, and I was just looking back over the report. There were 2 states that made references in the 2014 review to middle school CTE. One was in Florida, legislation related to their digital tool certificates and industry certifications, expanding that more into the middle grades. And then there was another, in Mississippi, there was also legislation for a middle school dropout prevention pilot, and one of the prevention strategies that would be included would be focusing on CTE. So those are a couple examples from 2014, and I wouldn't be surprised if there were more in the future. There was a piece of legislation introduced on the federal level. I believe, Andrea, you fill me in if you remember more exactly. I believe it was last year, and it was related to expanding middle school CTE. I don't think it really progressed very far. but that is something that is on people's minds.
You're correct in that it was from Senators Kane and Baldwin. It didn't pass necessarily, but I know they've also resurrected some CTE bills this year, so we'll see where things go. But there was one related to middle school and CTE in Congress last year.
Right, thank you so much again for your comments. Right, so if there are any more questions, feel free again to use chat box and ask. For those of you who I know joined us a little bit later on, just to give you some insight into what's happening afterwards, we will have the recorded full online seminar available on ACT's YouTube channel, and also we'll pass it over to NASA CTEC for open it up for the public, and we will also have the PowerPoint available on both NASA CTEC and ACTE's website. I think we have one more question here for you all. To what extent are states evaluating the success of their CTE programs in terms of successful employment of students upon completion of CTE experiences?
That is usually in several of the states that you see referenced in the data reporting and accountability category. Several states that was part of the element of the reporting was sharing more so with just reporting rather than with accountability as far as affecting funding streams, but certainly providing that information to future students and parents about how graduates have achieved in the workplace.
I would concur with what Catherine said. And additionally, also pointing back to Florida, although this doesn't have to do with outcomes of student graduates, but the return on investment work that they were doing with certifications. So that was kind of another example of that.
Very nice. Thank you so much for both of you. Any more questions? We have a few more minutes left. I actually have one more question here for you all. Would you expect a Perkins reauthorization bill to address some of these same topics?
Yes, I would. Obviously not speaking to anything in particular since it's early stages, but certainly, and sort of as we've mentioned throughout, this whole sort of idea of a comprehensive system that crosses different education boundaries, that is involved with industry and partnership through numerous activities that happen not just in the classroom, but work-based and the earning of post-secondary credit, all leading to that credential that has value in the workplace. I would expect to see a lot of those themes echoed in a reauthorization. Maybe that's just, I hope to see.
Very nice. Thank you, Catherine. If Andrea or Catherine, if you have any final comments or to our audience, feel free to do so right now. And again, any more questions, we are open to those as well.
So Leah, I was just going to post a link to the ACTE page where the report and soon these slides will be posted. Is that okay?
Perfect. Go right ahead.
Okay.
And I'm also going to do the same for the NASA CTEC website as well. Yeah, so for NASA CTEC, you can reach it at careertech.org/papers. We have it there for download, and then just as soon as we have this recording, we will also attach the link to the YouTube page where it will be as well. So you can catch the webinar and share it with your colleagues.
It's perfect. Thank you so much again to Catherine and Andrea for being our speakers today, and we really appreciate all the work you guys are doing. Again, if there are no further questions or comments from Andrea or Catherine, I thank you all for coming out today. If you ever need any help or questions or concerns about ACT's online seminars, feel free to contact me. Again, my name is Celia Loomis. I'm the Digital Media Coordinator at ACTE, and my email is sloomis@acte.org. online.org. So again, feel free to direct any questions or concerns to me. And I thank you all again for coming out and being with us today, and have a great rest of the day.
Thank you, everybody.